Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. I'm actually in the United States at the moment. So it's nice and early in the day for me. I imagine there's a bit of fatigue. It's the end of the day in Hull. But lovely to be here, and I thank everyone for the opportunity to have a chat today. I think the critical thing I'm going to talk about today is the growing from being a Hull company or starting in Hull, and actually where I've managed to get a company globally now. And then really some of the lessons learned. So my name is Carl Dawson. I'm the co-founder of a company called Construct Education. We're based in London, Salt Lake City, and Cape Town. And I will now share the deck. Great, and hopefully you can all see that fine. So like I say, I'm Carl Dawson, the co-founder of Construct Education. And like I say, today we're going to talk about building globally, how we built the company that we've built now. So we're 180 people around the world. We work in the digital education space. So I just want to do a very brief reflection on really where education is in 2020, particularly in the digital context. And then really what I'd really like to focus in on today was starting from Hull, some of the great things that gave us and some of the limitations, but also some of the opportunities that come from that. And then lastly, for anybody who's here at the startup end of the journey, looking at some of the lessons learned that we've had over the last few years. So the success of the company has been very much around building global. In terms of being very vehemently anti-Brexit, we've still embraced the fact that export was going to be absolutely critical to us. So we have delivered in the Middle East, in the United States, and in Europe. And really, it's the only way that we have managed to build that global company and to build a company that's been successful. We actually found it far easier to sell in the United States and in Qatar, and even, ironically, in places like France and Switzerland than we did in the UK. In terms of being perceived as a British company and being small, there was definitely a tendency in the UK to stick with some of the bigger players in the market. Whereas what we found when we went abroad was that there was a much more early adopter kind of sentiment and mentality. The other critical thing I'd say around building globally is, and we'll talk a bit about it later, is really to have the sentiment that if you're going to go for that international approach, you've got to be all in. In terms of the travel I've done over the last 5 years, even in the first 3 months before the pandemic last year, I flew 112,000 miles just in 3 months. If you're looking at a global export company, the digital side of things is great, but still a human reaction, a human relationship that's going to be absolutely critical. So the two things here are a British brand works well abroad, and actually we found it limiting within the UK. And secondly, really to look at actually committing fully to the export model. The second piece around this was to look at operating from global hubs. So we have leveraged the best of the UK, the best of the USA, best of the Middle East, and also built out a global team based down in Cape Town. So having over 100 staff in Cape Town now, what's been really critical is looking at being able to manage time zones, communication, and really embracing the best of online tools to be able to build a truly global company which has its own culture, which has its own identity, and is able to deliver globally. We've found that if you can get it right, it's as easy to deliver in Doha as it would be to deliver in Doncaster. In terms of by the time you're getting on a plane, it doesn't really matter where you're going, and it's having a model that is able to be successfully reproduced over and over again. Now, the three elements of a global technology company, there's three potential routes that you can go. It's either going to be consultancy, it's going to be services, or it's going to be pure technology play. One thing that we did learn from a cultural point of view was it was very difficult to manage to be all three. And we have focused very specifically on the services side of things. So we were a custom development house. We did build our own platforms out. And we did do some very high-end consultancy stuff. What we've actually found is those are three different cultures. So if you're looking to try and look across both an international perspective of managing a team and building a culture, and then also building different business models, there are very different business models, and I'll talk a little bit more about that again later. Just in terms of education, so for me, the toothpaste is definitely out of the tube from an education point of view. What we have seen this year is that COVID has changed everything. In very simple terms, I think it's really now higher education, for example, corporate education specifically. We used to have a lot of arguments or conversations with potential clients, be they universities or corporates, and they would say, why would I do that? And how much does it cost? And where is it? What does that look like? Now, our challenge as a company is just to have capacity to be able to deliver the sheer tsunami of work that's coming our way. And that's meant that really we've had to stop any of the arguments about as to why and how and what we do. And now it's really looking about how we can continue to scale. Why I think that toothpaste is out of the tube is that even so, I'm based in the United States, and even when I went for some fried chicken a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to one of the guys there who was doing his undergraduate degree at the local university, and he was asking what I did and why I was in the States and why I had an English accent. And I explained digital education, online education, and really he was saying, well, why would I spend 30, 40 bucks of gas and put it in my tank and drive into the university to do those giant lecture hall, theatre style talks, when actually I could do that from home and I can still have a job and that side of things. So from a learner point of view, you will see an evolution towards picking and choosing what's the right things. So those big at scale talks, those will go by the by, but actually hopefully that will then mean that we move more back to a tutorial based model where the teacher, the lecturer, the faculty is highly respected. If you look at it in a different way, the fact that you can still get face-to-face training for your 7-year-old in a local school, where else are we getting that kind of face-to-face kind of interactivity and that side of things? So actually, if we look at the time where the teacher is being hugely valuable, and then there is an enabler as more than just sort of teaching from rote, whether you're looking at corporate education, primary schools or higher education, it's a different way of looking at it. And actually, hopefully, it will put a far higher value on the teacher. Secondly, in terms of education, we really need to understand the likes of LinkedIn, the likes of Google, just look at the things in a totally different way. So from an education point of view, there's a thing called economic graphs, which people which organizations such as LinkedIn use to look at what skills are needed where. So they will be looking at kind of traffic around skill sets and new work and recruitment drives. And they're looking at how can they really look at that on a global level in terms of education is a means to an end, and it's a means to money, basically. And when you look at it from that point of view, where does that compete with schools and university? And the final one, the bit that I'm most passionate about, having started my career in graduate development and apprenticeships, is that we do really need to start, really looking at blending secondary, tertiary, and workforce education. One of the initial investors in the company from my end was somebody who had gone through an apprenticeship program, become senior management in a blue chip company. He didn't get his the equivalent of GCSEs back in the day, but ended up with a master's level program by working through the company as an apprentice and then becoming a manager and then getting trained up and going back. This is not new. This is what big companies used to do. This is what the coal industry or the fishing industry used to be great for, actually developing people from end to end. We need to find a new way of doing that for the modern world. And that's really just a bit of a graph here around really blending, looking at the labor data, looking at competencies and actually pulling all this through, but making that a human experience rather than it just being sort of feeling kind of robotic. This is really where I would like to see the education sector going as a whole. Okay, moving on to the Hull specific side of things. I started my career in Hull. I tried to find a photograph from the Hull Daily Mail a few years ago where I was in what could only be described as a very oversized and very shiny suit. I think it would be described as my first suit of when I started the company in Hull. And really, there were some real benefits and some real limitations from a Hull point of view. I saw a lot of the context of the conference in terms of some of the sound points that are there. And I think there's some really consistent things that are still there that have been blockers for a number of years, but still a lot of opportunities as well. So start with my mindset. When I set up the company in Hull, felt that Hull was the cause of any of the problems I had as a company. In terms of my own mindset, I saw Hull as the limiting factor. And if I could only get to London and tap into London talent, London skills, and London mindset, it was going to be a totally different kind of planet, and everything would be far more professional and big and easy. What I realized very quickly was that the people that I met in Hull, or the companies I worked with in Hull, and the team I had in Hull were as good, if not better, than anywhere else I have found in the world, let alone in London. The one limiting factor was that I was trying to look at it almost from a Hull point of view, whereas London had a lot more opportunities. The skills, the competencies, the experience were there in Hull, and I needed to change my mindset to actually be able to look beyond Hull and to look beyond Yorkshire in terms of running as a business. Because then when I did move to London, I found exactly the same things. In terms of, I then felt that London was the kind of limiting factor. So once I looked at it from a global point of view, I realized that some of those issues were with me, and that actually all those skills and everything existed. And really it was about then finding business all the way around the world and actually harnessing the skills that I could find in any given location that we were in. So if anybody is sat in Hull today thinking, if only I was doing this from somewhere else, those things are true no matter where you are, is my kind of takeaway from all of that. The three things that Hull did particularly well, the mentoring side of things, there was a real desire to help. I was back in the day, relatively young, setting up the company. There was a real desire to help from experienced people in the city. One of the funny stories was we had a break-in, unfortunately, and all the computers and all the diaries and even all the plugs were stolen from the office in Land of Green Ginger. That literally the whole office was stripped, including the diaries. And a local, very large petrochemical company, you can probably guess, immediately stepped in that afternoon and gave us some of their old obsolete computers, and we were back up and running within 3 or 4 hours of having lost the entire company, basically. And that kind of support, that kind of help, both on a human level, it was a shoulder to cry on one day, it was somebody to talk to the next day. That was what Hull did particularly well. And back to that identity, there was no shortage of people and companies locally that were looking out for local companies in terms of giving us business opportunities and really trying to help us. And it's only now reflecting back on that a number of years later that I can actually see that existed. And the final one was that the skills did exist. There were some limitations around those in terms of scale and capacity, which I'll talk about, but be it accountancy, legal, etc., there were great, stable support services that in existence in Hull. The limiting factors, and this I think can actually be, extended to the whole of the UK, not just to Hull. The first one was just how tricky it was to get finance in the first place. The company I have now is now a multi-million company. It's a global, it's very successful, and we're not short of people approaching us from a finance point of view, from an investment point of view. But back in the day, it was very, very, very hard to get it off the ground. So going to the local banks was an absolute non-starter. We found that in London as well. The banking system in the UK was terrible for supporting startups and even growing businesses. But really, if you compare it to somewhere like Silicon Valley or even Silicon Roundabout in London, there was no structured investment approaches that were available. So there was just not an investment community. There were business angels. We found a few of those, but really there just wasn't that structured approach. One thing I would like to see in terms of an opportunity is to look at, in the same way that we're, for example, around the Boston area and Massachusetts area, you have an investment community that really runs up and down the freeway there. There is enough talent through the M62 belt that's very specific, be it digital, be it manufacturing, be it pharmaceuticals, for example, that have been successful and understand industry. But I think we need to look at it as a bare minimum, not just as the Humber region, but also looking at Liverpool, Leeds, Sheffield, Hull, etc., in terms of looking across that kind of broad swathe. The second one, in terms of the one limiting factor for the mentoring side of things, was that many of the companies that we came into touch with in Hull were what I would call lifestyle businesses. They were great consultancies that had a small group of maybe 2 or 3 consultants working together on very specific issues. But really, the bit that we struggled with in terms of finding access to were people that had scaled companies. So we now have around 150 to 180 staff. It's a very different mindset, and the mentors that really grow businesses like that, it's a very specific skill set. And if that could be identified within that Humber digital community, that's really where I'd say anybody who's looking at anything beyond the startup and actually looking at that scale up phase is really critical. And the last one is, and I think both the previous speakers have kind of talked around the skills side of things, really, we are recruiting and we're hungry for as many people as we can possibly get, but it's in very niche skill areas. They're not that difficult to train, and they could be a very structured program, but being able to develop and deliver those skills on tap, just in time skills, basically, if the Humber region could get behind that and find a way of matching the requirements of industry. For us, Sligo, Cape Town, Bandung, and Hull are all the same thing. We need the people at the right price to be able to deliver to quality and on time. And then finally, looking at building a global digital business from the UK, just looking at some of those limiting factors from Hull, but also then looking at it from a UK point of view. In terms of the lessons I've learned over the years, first is to understand the importance of finance to building a company. There are many doors that I've discovered over the last few years that I never knew were there, in terms of looking at the path from venture capital to private equity, through to kind of corporate buyouts and that side of things. If you can find a way of learning that system, there are different ways to build a company in a far more efficient way, and perhaps not having to have so many scars as I've had building the company, and that's critical. Secondly, in terms of building the global company, we have succeeded by having local partners around the world, be that in the Middle East, in the United States. In terms of jiu-jitsu approach, we've really used what could potentially have been competitors to us around the world, and actually use their networks and work with them to bring the best of the skill sets that we had and the capabilities and competencies that we had, and then actually use them to really attack those local markets. And that's how we achieved 500% growth last year. And we were named one of the fastest growing companies in the UK by Deloitte just a couple of weeks ago. For me, it was based on that. We worked with them and through them to actually sort of look at that global approach. Third one, people, no matter whether it's in Hull, whether it's in Cape Town, whether it's in Saudi Arabia, chaos theory in terms of people are always the biggest challenge, because people are people and you cannot account for what it is. We run a people business. We need to look after them. We need to do the best by them. But that has still always been the hardest piece. Finding, recruiting, developing the right people is the biggest challenge, no matter where you are globally. And then accelerators. So we were privileged to go through the Google Campus Accelerator down in London, and also the Telefonica Accelerator. And they were really useful things for us. And I know that there are accelerators available in the Humber region. They are great to experience, but the critical thing is you must bring your own commitment and ability to kind of translate the support you will get through that accelerator into real life. Do not sit back and expect them to do the work for you. But sit back, listen, people have done this before. Don't doubt it, don't be dubious, don't be skeptical, but bring your own A game in terms of converting that. And then the final piece for me is looking at mental health. The critical thing for me over the last few years has been having a support network. There are days when it's been very hard. There's been days when it's been easy. For me, in terms of running the company, a three-legged stool of three co-founders basically has been the best approach to that, because that means you've got stability no matter whether it's a good day or a bad day or one of you's having an argument or not. But the mental health piece, people tell you about success, people tell you about failure, but the piece that isn't told is the bit that's in between, which is just the hard graft every single day, getting back to the coalface and keep chipping away to bring it there. And then make sure that your support networks have got support networks for them, be that family, be that friends, be that work colleagues. Make sure that there is robust resilience built within the system around that support network side of things. So that's it from me. I will now there. And that's it. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to answer any questions. As you can see, it's really just a sense of lessons learned from the industry.